Okay, everyone, good morning. My name is Maria Tooker, and I'm the co-chair of our volunteer committee here at WCS. I'm also on the board of directors, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us at this professional development workshop, the ABCs on ESG reporting. This workshop will provide a thorough overview of the purpose and process of ESG reports, guiding you through the high-level steps needed to assemble a robust and compliant report. So you'll learn about the typical timeline for report preparation, ensuring you can plan and execute your ESG strategy effectively. We'll also explore various report frameworks, including the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and other leading standards to help you choose the best approach for your organization. In addition to foundational knowledge, this workshop will delve into the practical aspects of ESG reporting, such as data collection methods and addressing common challenges. You'll gain insights into best practices for creating transparent and impactful reports and managing stakeholders. By the end of this workshop, you'll be equipped with the tools and basic knowledge to navigate the complexities of ESG reporting, ensuring your organization meets regulatory requirements and communicates its ESG purpose effectively to stakeholders. So now let's move on to the agenda. Okay. All right, so first I'll give you some context on what WCS is and how you can get involved. Then we'll be going to do a brief workshop introduction. Next, we'll welcome our corporate sponsor, Nextcracker. Then our speakers will guide us through the workshop, and then we'll have some Q&A, and afterwards we'll close the event. All right, so first of all, who are we? WCS is a nonprofit organization originally founded in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're now in 17 countries with a membership base of more than 500 professional women and men, and this organization aims to support women in their careers in the clean tech industry. WCS is going on 13 years now, which is impressive considering we're a majority volunteer-run organization. We also hold monthly virtual events, such as this one, in-person socials, and professional development workshops. You can check out our event page for more information and register for any upcoming events. Now let's check out our events. So on September 8th, we have a hike and network event coming up. September 10th and 11th will be at RE Plus. September 13th, we have an exclusive networking event for WCS members. And October 30th, we have another professional development workshop, which is accelerating sustainability with artificial intelligence. Before we start the conversation, here are some tips for respectful and engaging conversations. You're all probably pretty familiar with this after 4 years of virtual meetings, but here are a few reminders. Please write out your full name on your Zoom profile. Turn on your video if you feel comfortable. We love to get to see your faces. WCS volunteers, please add an asterisk next to your name. And then out of respect for our speakers, please mute yourself during the presentation. We encourage you all to add your LinkedIns to the chat and connect with other attendees. The more you get involved with the event, the more you will benefit from it. If you're interested in becoming a member, as an individual member, you'll have access to the WCS events calendar, virtual events, hikes, in-person events, and virtual workshops with 50% off, as well as mentorship, early access to event recordings, and much more. WCS corporate membership is a great way to elevate your corporate brand, offer professional development opportunities for your employees, and connect with industry professionals worldwide. So we will drop in the chat the email address if you're interested in membership. So today's moderator, Pam, is one of our WCS board members. She's also involved in our career development, and she leads our professional development workshops. She's the CEO and founder of Green Training Associates, which is a talent development firm specializing in corporate sustainability. Pam has been in corporate training for 24 years, and she has 30 years in global sales training, 24 in technology, and 15 in sustainability. She's an incredible WCS member, and let's welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to welcome you to the ABCs of ESG Reporting. I'll be your moderator to guide your learning experience with our expert presenters today as we dive into the critical world of environmental, social, and governance reporting. We're thrilled to have you all here. We change women's lives at WCS with our skill building workshops, and so we host them once a quarter. Feel free to come out. October 30th is our next program. So I'll be introducing our speakers shortly. I have a brief message from our sponsor, Nextracker, but we're going to get insights into best practices over creating transparent and efficient reports, managing stakeholders and disclosures. So by the end of this program, you're going to have the tools and basic knowledge to get yourself started on ESG reporting. So this is an increasingly important landscape. So let me introduce Nextracker as our corporate sponsor for today's event. So Nextracker is a group of diverse people that are technology innovators and clean energy activators. They are a collaborative team. They do the right thing. They're accountable and deliver results. They believe in equity and inclusion, and they're committed to sustainability and decarbonization and a better tomorrow. So at Nextracker, they're on a mission. They want to be the most trusted and valued renewable energy company by delivering intelligent, reliable, and productive solar power. Some quick facts. Nextracker is a leading provider of intelligent integrated solar tracker and software solutions. They have utility scale and ground-mounted distributed generation solar projects around the world. Just some basic facts: 100 gigawatts of smart solar trackers, 138 million annual CO2 emissions saved in metric tons, 18 million powered homes annually, 37 coal plants decommissioned annually, and 30 million cars off the road annually. And so they're an impressive company. They're a longstanding WCS supporter. We have them as our sponsor for today, and we thank Nextracker for their WCS corporate membership. Next slide. Well, today's speakers are extraordinary. I have some really impressive ladies to introduce you to. They are role model in the regulatory and compliance space. We have Olga Touretz, who's a corporate associate at Morrison Foster, and Oluwabamish, we call her Bamishe, Onabanju, and she's an ESG analyst at Morrison Foster also. So let me give you their bios briefly, and then I'll introduce the program and we'll get into the content, which is what we're all here for. So next slide. So Olga Touretz is a corporate associate in the San Francisco office. She engages in corporate and transactional practice. She represents companies and investors across a broad range of corporate and security law matters. She works with private companies, represents clients for venture capital, growth equity, and corporate venture financing, merger acquisitions, and you name it. She is the go-to person around corporate practice, and certainly a financial wizard with regard to all of her expertise. She has a public company practice, including advising clients on federal securities and law compliance, which is extraordinary, compliance with listing standards on the NASDAQ, corporate governance issues. So she is fantastically involved in advising public clients on new disclosure requirements and best practices, and in particular in disclosures concerning ESG and governance factors. We have truly a deep expert to share with you everything she knows about the disclosure requirements. She and Bamishe are going to be an enormously knowledgeable expert team for us. So thank you, Olga. Let me introduce Bamishe. So Bamishe is an ESG analyst also in the San Francisco office for Morrison Foster. In her role, she assists with legal research and analysis regarding ESG regulations in the US and all jurisdictions where MoFo, we call MoFo for short, Morrison Foster is her company, where they have offices or provide services. She assists with drafting compliance policies and procedures for asset managers, public companies, private companies, as well as integrating ESG aspects of diligence in investment and merger acquisition. She is Nigerian trained as an attorney, experienced working across the intersection between law and public policy. And prior to joining the firm, she has worked at Yale Law School and at the Office of Undergraduate Studies at Duke at University. So both of these ladies have deep expertise. They can't wait to talk to you today. So let me give a workshop introduction, one more slide, and turn it over to Olga. So we have this opportunity as ESG reporting becomes increasingly essential in today's business environment. Regulatory landscapes are evolving rapidly. Companies are under greater scrutiny from investors, customers, and other stakeholders to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability and ethical governance. And that means data transparency. It means following regulations, the compliance space. And today we're going to give you the tools and knowledge you need to stay ahead of these changes and excel in your ESG reporting efforts. And of course, MoFo is the team to go to if you have a need to figure out what your company's reporting structure is and the governance and disclosures and how to. So we have an amazing opportunity, great topics lined up for you. And you're going to learn about the high-level steps for an impactful document, the comprehensive nature, the typical preparation timeline, what the pitfalls and challenges are, what the things to be aware of, red, yellow, green lights. We're going to have all kinds of exciting information to get you started here. So your participation is crucial. We encourage you to engage actively, ask questions, network with each other, put your LinkedIn profiles and your connection information in the chat, because we want you to be participating and getting to know each other. And also, of course, chat your questions. We've got a chat monitor who is going to pick up on, those questions, and Olga and Bamashe will do their best to connect with the questions. If not during the program, we certainly can have follow-up with them afterwards, because it is a complex subject, and I'm sure that we'll do our best to answer questions as well as support you during the program and following the program. Really, the complexity of ESG reporting and driving meaningful progress within organizations is important. So let's dive into this exciting journey together. So I'm going to then invite you. Are you all ready? Let's create a tidal wave of change. Next slide. Let me introduce Olga. Without further ado, Olga, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Pam. So essentially, ESG reports seek to do two things. First, they show how a company is performing on metrics it either chooses to disclose or is required to disclose by applicable rules, regulations, industry standards. Or they tell how a company integrates certain actions in their business to become more sustainable. One tends to lean a little bit more regulatory, one tends to lean a little bit more marketing. Performance-related disclosures lean more towards quantitative measures, measuring how an entity has fared on certain metrics. For example, performance disclosures, California's SB 253, it requires GHG emissions disclosures. There isn't as much room for narrative in those kinds of disclosures. It's you are stating the numbers. Behavior-related disclosures, on the other hand, delve into how a company integrates ESG risks and opportunities in its business, products, and services during the reporting period. Examples of corporate behavior can be seen in the EU CSRD policies, processes, and practices disclosures. Next slide. So there are a lot of purposes of ESG reports. They serve diverse purposes to different stakeholders. They also serve different purposes for companies. They range from compliance to market opportunities, and they're crucial tools to help you convey your company's position, commitment, values, and performance to your stakeholders. Understanding the purpose of the report that you're publishing really helps a great deal with the drafting phase. And your objective based on all the items listed on the slide will help you understand what to include, what to elaborate on, or what to just merely touch on at a high level. Next slide. So as I alluded to, there are different types of ESG reports and disclosures. Long before there were new regulations to standardize the ESG space, companies had published ESG reports largely to satisfy stakeholder demands as well as for marketing purposes. For example, corporate social responsibility reports, which were the precursor to the ESG reports, SASB reports, CDP reports, and GRI reports. There are many others. Regardless of how regulators have behaved and will behave, the markets are going to continue to ask companies to make certain ESG disclosures, and that's the reason why there are so many types of ESG reports. Mandatory reports are, as you could guess, are the result of a need to regulate and standardize the ESG space and ESG reporting. They come from governing bodies. There's usually fines and penalties for failing to do those. Those are not an optional report. If your organization is subject to mandatory reporting, you will need to be publishing them. Examples include CSRD reports. They include the California reports whenever they're published. And if you're a public company, if and when the SEC climate rules go into effect, those would also be another example. Voluntary reports, on the other hand, predate mandatory reporting, and those are reports that your company chooses to publish, whether because internally you find value in them or externally your stakeholders are pushing for them. The companies typically design them by using their initiatives, their objectives, or they're based on peer benchmarking, or usually it's a little bit of a combination of both. It's what are, our peers doing in the industry and what can we actually report on. A combination of peer benchmarking and the internal drive and systems to make those reports is critical. It doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. If you're not able to produce the report, it's probably better not to put something out there. It is also important to note, especially if you are choosing to publish voluntary reports, they're still subject to risks and liabilities. And we'll talk about that, more about that a little bit later. Next slide. Next slide. So just to provide a quick overview of industry agnostic standards and frameworks, excuse me, the SB 253 just requires companies to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That is emissions from operations, purchased electricity, and value chain emissions, respectively. SB 261 asks for a little bit more. It requires companies to disclose how they manage their climate-related financial risks, including governance, strategy, metrics, and targets. And then AB 1305 is California's response to companies increasingly adopting carbon offsets for their climate targets. It's designed to improve transparency in voluntary markets, as well as to provide a standardized reporting framework. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. Sorry, this is Banshay's slide.
You're fine. So before we go into the regulatory stuff, we're going to talk about like the standards, frameworks, and protocols that companies have been using before regulations came. So just like Olga had said earlier, regulations came like kind of after the markets had already like started publishing their own disclosures. And so like, the companies had started like decades ago, and then regulators are like, okay, wait, what's going on here? Because like investors are now relying on these disclosures. And so before the regulations came, it was these standards that companies are using. So I would flag that the standards that we're discussing now are not all the ESG standards out there, but they're like the industry agnostic standards, meaning that you can apply them across board for like any type of company. So the first, except for the SASB that will be on the next slide. So the first I will talk about is the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. These are fairly new. They came last year, but so far they're like the new frontier of voluntary ESG reporting. So regulators across like 120 jurisdictions have endorsed the standards, and about 20 jurisdictions have said they're actually going to adopt it into their national laws. So they sent the S1 standards, that's on like sustainability related disclosures. Essentially, like they align with the TCFD, which is like the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and they ask companies to make disclosures on their governance of ESG strategy, metrics and targets, and risks and opportunities. But they're mostly like based on financial materiality. So financial materiality, essentially, how do ESG factors affect a company's value? So look at these as like outside-in effects. If something happens externally, can it cause the company's stock price to drop, for example? And that's all, they don't go further. But the GRI standards, which are next, are double materiality, and they are older than the IFRS S1 and S2 standards, and they take a double materiality approach. That is, they look into how a company's actions affects its ecosystem and how a company's ecosystem affects the company. So it's like a two-way street under the GRI standards. They're asking companies for two things. What are you doing and what can be done from you from the outside that would affect you as an organization? The third is the OECD guidelines. They're like frameworks from like international organizations. They're also not regulations, but like certain regulations, like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is the most recent, will ask companies to rely on them to guide them on how to comply with those requirements. So just think of like these standards and regulations as like two different frameworks, but that work together in perfect harmony. Can we go to the next slide? And so like the task force on climate related financial disclosures, they are somewhat the baseline that many of the voluntary standards that we see today follow. So they have 4 recommendations, and these recommendations have been integrated in the standards and in many of the regulations that you see today. So they're like the basis for most of them. Then the ISSB standards, they're integrated in the IFRS S1 and S2, and they're now part of like the International Sustainability Standards Board. And what they do is that just like the IFRS S1 and S2, they only ask for financially material information. What information is important to your investors from like a financial materiality perspective. So they don't look at how a company, for example, a company's actions, for example, can contribute to like climate externalities. They look at how climate externalities can affect a company. So they take that, like just that one directional view. And the US is a jurisdiction that is mostly like based on that. So most of like the standards, the frameworks, like the activities of regulators in the United States are based on financial materiality, while the EU, you can think more of it from like the GRI perspective, asking for like double materiality information. And lastly is the Carbon Disclosure Project. I feel like this is one of the most popular that companies have been using for years to disclose their climate performance. So if you look into a lot of companies that have published their ESG or sustainability reports, if you go into the appendix, for the most of them, you would see their CDP disclosures. They're also TCFD aligned. They ask for like strategy, they ask for metrics, risks and opportunities, they ask for governance, but they're somewhat the most popular. But recently, they have now also been integrated by the ISSB, and so they can be used to fulfill like IFRS S2 disclosure requirements. Can we go to the next slide? So we also have the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI. These are also pretty popular, and they essentially ask companies to look into like beyond, like using carbon offsets, how can you use like science-based targets to actually reduce your emissions? So these are more like scientific. They require more actions from companies. They're more detailed, and it's beyond like just like financially purchasing offsets. They want companies to actually take certain actions to reduce their emissions. Then we have the policy link standards. These are geared towards like diversity, equity, and inclusion type of issues, and they are working towards advancing racial and economic equity. So for example, most of the previous standards like the CDP, they lean more toward, and the SBTI lean more towards climate, but the policy link standards lean more to the S in ESG, and also how S issues actually can affect climate change. And I know that like at the WCS talks in January, someone had talked about like the interwovenness of like the E and S, and it was a very beautiful talk. Then lastly, we have the responsible innovation labs, and so RI labs, essentially, they help founders and startups that are building new technology or developing new technology products to think about like the entire product life cycle. So if you're putting out technology out there, what are the risks, what are the opportunities from an ESG perspective? And one thing that the RI labs does consistently is that they constantly map their standards to regulations to ensure that whatever they're asking founders to do tie to regulations and can help founders as they grow to be able to align with regulations. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, so I'll pass it on to Olga.
So this is where I jumped ahead to. I'm not going to go over these again, but these are the California climate regulations that have gotten a lot of press. For all 3 of the regulations, it's really unclear on what it means to operate in California. But usually the way that you can determine whether or not you'll fall into their scope, in addition to having their threshold requirements, is, whether you're transacting business in California, generating certain revenue, or having payroll there, those are all going to be considered as factors. And I just want to note that in terms of the timing of implementation, they were initially, some of these were going to go into effect January of this year, but it's likely that implementation is actually being pushed back, and it's, you know, we can keep you all updated on when these will go into effect. Next slide. So these are just the overview of the other regulations that are applicable. There's the EU SFDR, the CSRD, and the EU CS3D. I think we're running a little short on time, so if we can just go to the next slide, I'm not going to read through all of these. So when you're looking at your reporting obligations, particularly on the mandatory side, you're going to need to ask yourself whether, number one, if the regulation covers you directly, that's a pretty easy thing to determine. You know, you'll have to, if you meet the thresholds, you'll have to go ahead and report. The trickier one is whether the regulations might apply to you indirectly. Indirect coverage is going to happen as a result of business relationships. So for example, if you have a significant supplier that is covered by California SB 253, regardless of whether your company is generating 1 billion or not, you're likely going to be impacted by SB 253 via your supplier because of the Scope 3 reporting requirements. So your suppliers are going to come to you and ask you for your data and information so that they can satisfy the reporting requirements. And this is also true for the EU CSRD, where we've talked to companies who say, we don't have operations in Europe. You know, this doesn't apply to us. We don't have subsidiaries in Europe. And then you start digging in a little bit deeper, and it's like, well, okay, fine, we have some customers there, and it's very likely that the customers are going to start requiring you to provide increasing data. And I will note that some of the larger companies have started to look at trends, and so they're not necessarily just looking at what are the regulations currently requiring and asking for that, which they are. They're also starting to think ahead of where do we think this is going to go, and requiring their suppliers and vendors to provide additional information that may go beyond reporting the required reporting. Next slide. So the steps to creating a compliance program is really going to vastly depend on your organization. If you're a 3-person startup, you're not going to need to hire, you know, a whole compliance team. You're not going to need to create a board committee. You obviously can, but it would probably not be the best use of your time and money. So before you even start adopting the compliance program, it's really important to take a look holistically where you are as an organization in terms of company size, how you're structured, and then what reporting regimes you may or may not fall under, and go from there. So as I alluded to, the first step is usually to understand whether or not you're indirectly or directly covered by some of these regulations. If you are, then the question is less, should we adopt some type of reporting program? It's usually what reporting program do we need to adopt, and what metrics are we going to need to report on? So this process will help you identify what reports you're going to need to prepare. You'll want to identify overlaps across different reporting regimes. If you do this, if you take a piecemeal approach and you say, okay, we're going to comply with California, we're going to comply with EU CSRD, and you don't look at it across the board, you're going to be doubling up the work, and it's really not efficient. So the first step to creating any good compliance program is really taking a look at what is applicable to you, working with counsel, and identifying the areas where, you know, here's where we're definitely going to need to report, here's what we're going to need to report, and whether you can kind of double up. And for example, the data you're collecting for the EU CSRD, can you use that for California? Can you use that for some of your vendors? And so on. You'll want to reach out to business functions who have the data or manage the processes that you need to report on. For example, you know, product packaging units, human resources, facilities, operations. And as I was saying, this is going to vary largely on the kind of company you are. If you're a software company, you're not going to have packaging units, right? If you're a small startup, the odds that you have a dedicated human resources manager, if you're a team of 2 founders and maybe, you know, an engineer, is probably really low. So it's really important when you're identifying where the data lives that you're also thinking about where the data lives within your organization, whether or not it's necessarily reflective of a job title that you'd expect. You also want to look at timelines, right? You know, when do the regulations go into effect? When do you actually need to do certain things versus, you know, do we want to try to get ahead of them and start implementing compliance programs? You know, there are phase-in periods, there are safe harbors. There are a lot of things that you can do. The one thing that we always advise is do not wait until the regulations go into effect before you start looking at what data you have and what data you need. If you wait until the regulations go into effect, you're going to be behind the ball, because usually once the regulations are in effect, even with the phase-in periods, if you're an organization that's going from, you know, tracking none of this, and all of a sudden you have to track your scope 1, 2, 3, report that out, figure out, you know, all of this data, it's going to be overwhelming. So we would recommend get ahead of the ball, start early, figure out what you need to report, what you can report on easily, start reporting that and creating that internal process. So that way, when you actually have to provide the external reports, you're ready and in good shape. You're also going to want to reach out to your counterparties for data. If you're doing a lot of work with suppliers, if you are subject to scope 3 reporting, you'll need to get information from them. And that it's important to start having those conversations earlier, and potentially even building that into your contracts. I think a lot of companies have recently started seeing larger counterparties requiring more and more information sharing and more reporting. And, you know, considering whether or not that's something you also need to do in your contracts is going to be important. You'll want to track regulatory updates. The area is fast developing. So for example, you know, the California rules were going to go into effect, then they got delayed. SEC climate rules were adopted, they got delayed. So, you know, in order to really be ahead of the ball, you want to work with competent outside counsel who's able to help you stay ahead of that and make sure that you're aware of when things are going to be impacting you. It's also helpful, especially if you're a larger company, to create a central platform for all business functions to share data and collaborate on data needed to ensure coherence and consistency. A lot of these reports touch on multiple different business units, and so you'll want to make sure that everybody understands the reporting requirements and everybody is aware of what you all are reporting. Next slide. So this is one of our group questions that we'd really love your input. What do you think is necessary for inclusion in the reporting process, other than what we've just talked about?
We invite people to open their mic or write in the chat window your responses. So feel free to open your mic. We'll have a little interactive discussion at this point.
Don't be shy. There are no wrong answers.
So we have a question. Oh, the question is listed in that. There wasn't a question in there. Sorry about that.
I guess to open it more broadly, does anybody have any comments or questions on what Bamashe and I just talked about?
Well, not anything about that, but just trying to answer the question you just mentioned about what should be included in reporting processes, probably the sources of information, sources of data.
Yes, that is very important.
Units and yeah.
We have an answer in the chat. Obviously, CO2 emissions output from your operations.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important one to include. I think with that one, you do need to be, when you're reporting it, you need to make sure you properly outline how you're calculating that and gathering that. I think you know, it's becoming increasingly more standardized, but it's still not fully standardized on how companies are tracking that and calculating that. So it's important to be very transparent about how you are doing it if you are going to be publicly reporting it.
Could I ask a question of the speakers? I'm so curious. So when you all are looking at sort of maybe not the hard ESG data, but you're looking at the reports that come out of those ESG data, what are you looking for that you would consider that's a good report? Not necessarily like the data is showing that the company is doing good, but in terms of like the quality of the reporting, because sometimes when I read them, I'm like, oh, this feels like a PR piece. It's not really telling you a whole lot. So I'm just curious, with your expertise, what are some of the key things that you're looking for that makes it a good report?
Yeah, definitely. So on the legal side, what I'm really focused on is, number one, can you substantiate what you're saying? And number two, if you can, right, is your backup data actually reflective of what you're saying, or is this just a PR puff piece where you're really massaging the reporting? Really, I focus more on, are you accurately saying things? Are you potentially misrepresenting something? More of just like the things that could get you sued, basically, right? I'm less worried about, oh, this is a PR puff piece, as long as when you're saying something, you can substantiate it, or it's very clear that it's puff. Bamashe, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think when I'm looking at a report, something I like look out for is what company is like what company is this? What is their industry? And what are they saying about what they're doing? So I'm looking at, are they being too verbose? Have they identified way too many metrics? Are they are they saying, just like Olga said, are they saying things that they can substantiate? And is it is it user friendly for the audience? So if your audience, your target audience should pick it. So for example, like, are you a who is your audience? So are you a company whose stakeholders are more like, I also look at like generational considerations, like what is your target looking at? Are you publishing for investors? Are you publishing for like, your consumers? Are your consumers like people that just want to read something and grab it on the go? Or are they people that would, like financial experts and analysts that can sit down? Or are you publishing for like Gen Zs who want to like be able to like see something and grab it immediately? Because like the way that you communicate to your audience can put you at risk. If, for example, your audience cannot easily understand what you're saying, it's somewhat a red flag for greenwashing, because that's how like your stakeholders would latch onto certain things and they start looking further into it. So for me, I think what a good report would look like would be one that is based on materiality, like something that is particular, specific to your industry and your company, and a report that is simple, easily digestible, less is more, and just gives you what you need on the go. That's what I would, think of.
Yeah, and the other thing that I will say, right, if this is a mandatory report, we look at, are you complying with the regulatory requirements? So tying into the question of how do we identify and track the S&G metrics, right, if the regulation requires you to disclose your employee makeup and your report maybe says we have 100 employees and doesn't go further, that's something that we would flag as needing to be expanded on. In terms of how do we identify and track the social and governance metrics, the reason why we talk a lot about the environmental metrics is those are a lot easier to measure, right? We can talk about what the company's CO2 emission output is, and that usually has pretty easily verifiable data. When we start talking about governance, primarily what we're seeing is disclosure about what internal policies you have, what the board governance structure looks like, how the board oversees these processes. So for example, do you have the audit committee? If you have an audit committee, do you have the audit committee looking over these reports, especially the ones that have more of the data? And is somebody auditing them to make sure that you can back it up? Because, the lawyers are external. We don't have a good insight into your organization, and we can only do so much. We can only ask you, can you back this up? How are you backing this up? And if you tell us, yes, we are, and answer it satisfactorily, we don't know if that's entirely accurate, whereas the board has a lot more insight into that. In terms of social, what I'm seeing from companies is they usually talk about their employee benefits programs and the composition of their employees and what they're doing to, promote their employees' development and growth. Those factors are a lot harder to measure.
I think
sometimes there's DEI metrics too these days. Okay, yeah. Are you seeing that?
There's been a little bit more sensitivity with some of the litigation about more explicitly saying it. So companies will publish, here's our, employee minority breakdown. Here is the percentage of men versus women. You have you have required disclosures at the public company level of who is serving on your board, how many women do you have on your board. But there has been, especially with the anti-ESG legislation, some pushback, and companies are being a little bit more mindful about how they're talking about that, because, you know, affirmative action, you can't explicitly say that. So the questions really are, how do we go about reporting this without getting sued?
I think to just add to what Olga said, I think for the S&G metrics, most of what you would see in ESG reports is a discussion of processes more than impact. Because, for example, like she said, like some things like are not, it's just not so clear to measure versus like the like environmental. And for example, like I've been in this discussion with someone talking about how do you measure diversity in your organization, for example? So at the point of hiring, you hire 10 women, but like over the course of 10 years, how many women actually remain in the company? Because, you know, there's research that shows about how most women fall when they start getting to like the mid-level of their career. And so like that metric is, you know, identified in the beginning, but it's more longer term, like how resilient. And that's another thing, like the strategy pieces of your reports would ask you, how resilient do you test your processes? Do you test your metrics for resilience to like your business operations and like market trends? So if you hire 10 women at the beginning of like a class cycle, how many of them stay up to the point where they can be promoted to like the role of like a VP or a director or to be on your board? So those things take like longer runways to publish. Another thing is like, for example, whistleblowing. Why is it so important to employees that no one knows that they're the ones that are saying that thing? Like it goes back to like the corporate culture, because for example, employees should be able to like raise their hands and say, oh, XYZ is happening, but I don't like it. But employees are more focused on being able to ensure that whatever they're saying, or like grievance mechanisms, no one knows that it's them. And so like most of these things are like cultures and systems that are harder to track in the short term, and they take like longer runways to manifest.
Can I ask a more broad question just about kind of getting started? Like you hinted at materiality assessments for like a company that's just getting started but is big enough that they should be reporting out and is a domestic business. Like, is there two parts of the question? Like, is first step that you'd recommend a materiality assessment? And then is there a tool or a way to kind of quickly get to what are the mandatory or what are the preferred recommended voluntary reports we should be reporting out on?
So in terms of, you know, yes, the first step is always a materiality assessment, because that's going to help you understand what you as an organization are going to be reporting on. So it's, you know, first identifying, is there required mandatory reporting? And then number two, what are the material aspects that you need to report on? I will say, if you're just starting reporting, it's a good time to think about whether you can and should proceed with voluntary reporting. I would say before you start voluntarily reporting, it's better to make sure you have the robust systems in place, and then you can proceed. And usually the voluntary reporting tracks some of the mandatory reporting.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by robust systems in place, you mean on like data collection?
So it's largely data collections and reporting up and reporting out. I would say the first step for companies before they even come to lawyers is talking internally about what they currently have and what they currently need, and also looking at what their stakeholders and suppliers and customers are starting to ask for, and building out from there. And then talking to the lawyers about, you know, are there any mandatory reporting regimes that we're subject to? And if so, what are the requirements? And you know, what do we need to start thinking about, right? Because your outside counsel is really, really good for helping you get down to the nitty gritty of compliance and what is applicable to you, but they're not as good at, you know, looking inside your organization and saying, here's where the data lives, right? That's something that the organization needs to come tell us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll have more Q&A time. I'll encourage our speakers to press forward. We have much more content for you. And then we're going to have brief activity and more Q&A time. I also see there's some questions in the chat. Olga, do you think you want to answer the chat questions, or should we move forward and capture those at the end? What would you like to do?
I mean, I can quickly address the voluntary carbon market one. The answer is, in California, you might have to report if you're not subject to mandatory reporting requirements. Whether we recommend that you do or do not, it's really a company by company determination. Some people do report it, some people don't. We want to make sure that if you are reporting on that in terms of, if you're saying we've purchased credits, yeah, I think it's important to talk about the projects that they're supporting and the actual data behind the projects. There's been a lot of talk, especially recently, behind the quality of the carbon credits that are being purchased and the projects that they're actually supporting. And I mean, that's a whole separate presentation that can be done. It's a very complex area. But if we can go on ahead, we can get to the other content. So before you prepare your report. So this is a very overly simplified version of, what you need to start thinking about. The first question is always, is this disclosure mandatory? Do you have to report it? Is it mandatory because of regulation? Is it mandatory because you're an early stage company and you signed a side letter with an investor saying you'll do this? Or is it voluntary and this is something that you think it's good to do? Particularly if it's voluntary and this is something that your organization wants to press forward with, the next important question is, do you have a budget? If so, what is your budget? Figuring out how much you're able to spend on the report, and that should include, outside counsel fees if you engage outside counsel. It'll help you understand how robust you can get with your report. If you start with thinking about everything you want to report on and everything you want to say to your shareholders, and it's going to look so good, and you come up with a super complex report, and then you start trying to collect it and you start getting into the nitty gritty, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, this is going to cost my organization a bunch, and you're starting to get pushback, that, it's not super efficient. So it's always good to ask upfront, how much can I spend on this? Both, dollars and also people's time, because this does take time to produce a quality report. And then if this is a mandatory report, what do you have to disclose? What are the specific details that you have to talk about, right? Like there are things that companies really want to talk about, especially if there are certain metrics that they're really proud of. So for example, they have a very diverse leadership team, or their board is very diverse, or, their office is very eco-friendly and they have great metrics on that, right? You have to make sure if there's a required disclosure that you're complying with the requirements. And then if you choose to disclose additional things, you can. The next set of questions that you're going to start asking is, do we have enough people in our organization or the bandwidth for third parties to help with these disclosures? If you're a team of 3 people that is really focused on building out your product and scaling the company, those 3 people are not going to have time to create a, thorough, detailed, good report that is, public ready. Hiring third parties can get really expensive really and fast. And depending on the kind of reporting that you want to do, it might require you to really bring them into your organization and again, take time away from the building and the growing. The next question, as Bamashe was saying, is, who is our audience and what do they want to see? If your audience is, more of the Gen Z folk who want something quick, fast, ready, easy to digest, and you produce a hyper-technical report that publishes all your CO2 data and breaks down how it's calculated, line by line, some may appreciate that, but most will say, so what? And if you don't answer the so what, you might as well not have produced that report if it's not required. Next question is always really important. Do we have the data that we need? Because you really do not want to disclose what you cannot substantiate. Companies tend to want to highlight, areas that they're doing really well, and they don't want to highlight areas that they're not doing really well. You want to make sure that if you're doing this reporting, especially if it's voluntary, that it's painting a clear picture and it's not misrepresenting what you're doing. Next question is, do we have access to the data where it's stored? And what guardrails do we need around our disclosures? How do we ensure that we don't disclose data that can lead to privacy issues? So for example, data about your employees, right? You need to be careful that you're not disclosing certain information that could get you in trouble. Also in terms of data, if you decide to set the goal that you want to do scope 3 reporting, you need to ask yourself, can we get that information? Can we get that information from our vendors? Are our vendors going to provide us that information? If you're a larger company, that's a little bit easier to require. If you're a smaller company, maybe have 5 people, going to a large, ABC Corporation and telling them, give us all this data, the answer might just be like, no, we can't, or we won't, or we don't want to. And figuring out, you know, do you have the data that you need to properly report on what you want to report on? Another question is, are you saying more than you need to? What exactly is needed in the disclosure that without it being, you know, too much, right? You don't want to disclose everything. You don't want to disclose only the good things. So it's striking that balance, and it's making sure, again, as Bamashe was saying, the report is streamlined, easy to digest, but still being accurate. And then, you know, as I've been saying multiple times, if somebody asks for our backup data, can we substantiate what we're saying? The red light questions are, you know, these could stop, these can and should probably stop your report, right? Is disclosing this data going to be more cost intensive or expose you to more risks than the benefits that it provides? This is mostly for voluntary reporting, right? If you don't have to publish the data and you think that there's a risk that someone's going to push back on your calculations, or you're like, well, this is a great estimate, we think this is mostly right, but we can't really get the backup data for it, it's probably safer just not to publish it, especially if it's not required. If you take a look at your CO2 emissions and you're just like, wow, as compared to our peers, these aren't looking great, you know, maybe consider, you know, holding that report and instead working on improving those metrics before publishing something that's just focusing on, you know, the highlights and the good parts and leaving out any of the negatives. You know, thinking about whether or not you can discuss the metrics, targets, or goals with less details and the report still being, you know, thorough, accurate, and meeting the goals of your shareholders. And then finally, if somebody pushes back and asks, are you able to provide more details? And not just are you able, but do you want to? Because it's not going to be great if you publish a, you know, even if you send a report to your shareholders and a shareholder comes back and says, hey, can I, you know, how did you get this? Or can you provide a little more information? And your response is, no, we can't, or we don't want to. That might be worse than just not providing the information at all. Next slide.
Okay. So the next slides they're a bit duplicative of things that Olga has said, so I will brush through them quickly. So now you have passed, maybe you're on the green light or you're on the yellow light and you have decided, great, I want to disclose. What do you think about as you prepare your report? There's three things that I say to myself when I pick up a report. Is it short? Is it simple? Is it sweet? And when I say sweet, like, does it answer the questions? How does it like position the company? And this is mostly for like voluntary reports. For mandatory reports, there's only so much you can do. You can like work around like the narratives or how you disclose, but what you're supposed to disclose, there is only so much you can do about that one. So the first thing you want to think about is, who are your stakeholders? So stakeholders are like individuals or groups that are interested in like your business or that your business affects. That's a very high level way to think of it. So what are their priorities? What do they want to see? And this will be dependent on like the type of your stakeholders, the type of your business, and how can you engage them and secure their input on strategy and disclosures? Like, there are certain things that companies need the humility to look beyond like their windows and like their headquarters and like walls of their boardrooms to actually engage with their stakeholders. So, you know, we appreciate you for patronizing us. We appreciate your interest in our business. What would you like to see? How would you like to see us perform on XYZ issues? And you'd be surprised to like hear that oftentimes what you're thinking your stakeholders want is far from what they actually want. And I feel like when there's that disconnect between what your stakeholders want and what you're giving to them, that's where the unnecessary tension begins to build. And it's an unavoidable issue if you had just engaged with them. But I would flag that as much as you can afford it, that you conduct your stakeholder engagement with, you know, support from your lawyers, especially for like privilege. And the second thing you want to think about is materiality. What is material to our operations and performance? I talked about like the single and double materiality. Like a lot of times, like companies just like go to the market and, everyone is doing something, the loudest voices on social media, this is what everyone is saying, especially like, different times of the year when there's like certain themes around it. So we have like climate week coming up. You go to New York Climate Week, you see what everyone is talking about, then you want to immediately start disclosing on it. But is it material to your business? And so you want to be able to like do things that are just material to your business. And how do you prioritize? Because if you reach out to 100 stakeholders, you can come back with 50 issues. Now, it's not cost or resource effective for you to have 50 material issues. So you want to look at, okay, now our stakeholders have asked for 100 things. How can we leverage our resources to make the most impact? So when you're prioritizing issues for reporting, especially voluntary or like for even prioritization in like integrating or embedding ESG in your business, you want to think of how can we leverage our resources to make the greatest impact? Because like when different companies do that in their different like ecosystems, that's how we solve like the systemic issues that give birth to like most of the ESG risks that we are seeing today. And then when you prioritize, then you select what to disclose based on the data that you have, based on like the resources, maybe like the capacity of your staff or what the regulation is requiring. You don't have to disclose everything that you're doing. That's another pitfall that companies run into. You can be doing things internally. You don't have to talk about everything. Just talk about what is material and what your stakeholders really prioritize. Another thing is like your audience, similar to stakeholders, who wants the information? Is it a regulator? Is it like your investors? Is it your customers? Why do they want this information and what do they want to see? So as you're drafting your reports, as you're reviewing, make sure that you're checking those boxes. Then the next thing is, who are you delivering the report to? Are you delivering it to shareholders? Are you delivering publicly on your websites? So if it's shareholders, you can go into certain details there because that's like a targeted approach. But if you're disclosing publicly on your website, you want to be cautious because most people can't reach back out to you for context and you can't really explain things. And so like you also have to think about that. For regulatory requirements, what do regulators want to see? When do they want to see it? Why do they want to see it and how frequently? Some reports would be required, every 2 years, every year, monthly. They want you to update as like, information and trends evolve. And those are things that you want to have like a checklist of them that you're just ticking through. Can we move to the next slide? Another thing is alignment with standards and frameworks. I highly, highly, highly recommend this. I highly recommend this because one, it saves your time. Two, it makes it easy for like your investors, your stakeholders to be able to compare your performance to that of your peers. Because I feel like what I've seen in terms of ESG is that tension arises where information is not clear. So when information is not clear, like your stakeholders start looking for that and they're like, if they're being so vague, if they're being so verbose, are they hiding something or is there something that we need to see? And it can just lead to like this expedition that you could have avoided. And so I always advise alignment with standards and frameworks, especially because they also help you with regulations. So while regulations are pending, while you don't know what, sometimes regulations are published. For example, California asks businesses that operate in California to make certain disclosures, but the regulation doesn't say what it means to operate in California. So sometimes like regulations are very high level for good reason. They're not clear, but the standards go a little deeper because they predict the regulations. They've been, updated time after time as the market has disclosed. So after every reporting cycle, they hold consultations. They're constantly engaging stakeholders to see how they can improve the standards for good and bad reasons. But like, that also works. And so you can use those like voluntary frameworks to comply with regulation where the regulation permits it, or to just provide standardized reports. And that brings me to the next topic on peer benchmarking. What are your peers disclosing? What is your differentiator? And how do you communicate competitive advantage? This is good, but you also have to be very cautious. You don't just want to like get like under that peer pressure company-wise to go say things because your peers are saying it. Can you substantiate, like Olga said earlier, are you performing below what your peers are doing? If you're below what your peers are doing, then you want to think about, do we want to like pause here or do we want to like go ahead with publishing our disclosures? But it's very important to conduct peer benchmarking exercises because that is what your stakeholders are doing, especially your investors and consumers. They want to see how you stack up against a company that is in the same industry or like that is somewhat your peer. A very, very, very important part of ESG reporting is data management. I cannot overemphasize how important it is for you to pay attention to your data infrastructure. It's the biggest thing that can cause you like risk or like undue scrutiny from your stakeholders. Because if you say something, you have communicated something to your stakeholders and they can rely on it. And that reliance is where like the issues come. So how much of your material topics do you have data to substantiate? How often do you update your data? And do you have a central data management platform to ensure that your sales team is not saying something different from what your PR or your marketing team is saying? It's not saying something different from what your board is saying. So usually like ESG reports, there's a lot of moving pieces. You have like different parts of your reports that are owned by different functions within your business. And so what you want to do is to ensure that your report ties together, because the data, the information, HR is drafting, your human capital management, the sales is drafting, products is drafting on like life cycle. You want to ensure that whatever you're saying ties together. That's a huge issue I have seen with many ESG reports, is the incoherence and inconsistency. And also governance. Who vets your report and what is the vetting process like? Usually, the board has oversight, management teams lead on it. Who approves and what is the process for approval? And how do you update the information to keep it relevant? Governance is a big piece of your ESG report. And then lastly, organizational position and content. Like I said, as an organization, before you even start drafting your ESG report, you want to have like a theme that you want to communicate. And based on that theme is set, the tone is set at the board who, drafts the KPIs, distributes it like throughout the organization. And you want to ensure that you're communicating around that theme, which often should be rooted in materiality. So what are your organizational themes? What are your priorities? What is the tone? What are your objectives? You cannot afford to just talk about things or do ESG because everyone else is doing it. It has to tie back to your company. It has to speak to you. I don't know how many people go shopping and they're like, wow, this, I just picked this because it speaks to me. Like whatever you're deciding has to speak to you. Can we move to the next slide? And so like, in terms of like process for drafting your ESG reports, I'll go through this very quickly. Set a budget and try to stick with your budgets for your ESG reports and materiality assessment. So for example, if you're a smaller company, a desk research on what your stakeholders want will be good. If you're a larger company, you can do a more robust exercise where you engage with your stakeholders. Then you conduct a materiality assessment and you can leverage reports of like previously conducted materiality assessments and you just update it from time to time. Then set clear goals and objectives. I've already talked about this. Determine the cadence for reporting. Do you want to report every year? Do you want to report twice a year? Do you want to report monthly? You have to set the cadence, especially for voluntary reports. For mandatory reports, the regulators would typically tell you when and how to report. Then you have to select topics for disclosure based on topics that you have identified from your materiality assessment. Secure board approval for the topics and the metrics to be selected so that the board can decide whether this aligns with the organization's overall goals versus just what teams want to see. And also gather teams. So internal and external vendors, pull people together, leverage expertise, because you would not have all the expertise internally. Like Olga said, there are certain things like your external counsel would be able to like provide guidance from that you internally may not be able to see. Leverage the expertise of like GHG emissions experts or copywriters. But like while you do that, you also want to scrutinize everything that they're doing so that you're very sure that what they're producing for you, what they're asking you to disclose, ties with your overall mission and objectives. Can we move to the next slide? Also, like I've said, gather data, analyze and interpret your data through legal lens. So as you're thinking through what you want to talk about, look at it from a risk and opportunities. Can this open us up to litigation? Can this open us up to shareholder risk? And do you have sufficient data? Can you communicate the same thing using less data? And then you do a cost-benefit analysis. What's the risk versus what's the opportunities? You prepare your first draft, submit it to your lawyers for their assessment. Very important, because like when we read reports, in as much as we get excited about your strides, we're also looking at it like, what are the risks here? So we do like risk preemption analysis on reports when we typically get them, and then obtain external assurance. Sometimes regulations ask for that you get independent assurance for your reports. Share your reports with your board and secure board approval. Never publish a report that has not been approved by your board, and publish reports based on the required delivery method. Are you supposed to publish on your website, or are you supposed to deliver to an emissions registry, or are you supposed to just like share with your stakeholders? Can we move to the next slide? And there are some common pitfalls of ESG reporting. I'll run through those very quickly as well. First, with materiality assessment, some companies disclose really sensitive issues that can open them to a lot of risk during their materiality assessment. So think of you're going through your stakeholder engagement through a town hall. You invite your stakeholders to come have conversations, and they start asking you questions. On the spot, because they have asked, you begin to say things that you could have maybe said to them, we would take some time to discuss this internally and get back to you, as opposed to like just responding immediately. Because when you respond immediately, certain issues could be very sensitive, and you don't want to like fall into the pitfall of like talking about those things when you shouldn't. Some of these things that you go around to like ask questions about can be subject to discovery. And so you also want to think about that as you conduct your materiality assessment. And lack of board and legal oversight. You want to ensure that whatever you're going out, so even from your questionnaire, say you're conducting a survey, ensure that your board approves every questionnaire that comes out of your organization. Very important, because you want it to communicate what the board's priorities are and what they're trying to say. And so everything has to tie. Let your legal have oversight on it. Another thing is selecting too many material issues. Like, it's important to know that one company cannot solve all the ESG issues that we have. And so you want to focus on how you can leverage your resources to make the most impact. Another issue is poor data management, incoherent and inconsistent data, and sharing sensitive data without the needed legal guardrails around. So for example, like NDAs, before you share certain data with your vendors, are very important. And also like diverse teams internally not working from a centralized standpoint. So you don't want your sales team to have a different objective and goal from your procurement team. There has to be alignment. Now, different ESG issues present differently within like different business functions. For example, like your marketing team has very little to weigh in over your product life cycle. They just want to sell. And so you want to ensure that different teams are saying the same thing. And in the absence, and also sometimes we see that there is no central thing. It's not easy to like see coherence through a report. Like you want to be able to pull a report and like 3-5 minutes into reading it, you want to say that these are the company's priorities. And so it's communicated in how they do DEI, communicated in how they do governance, communicated in how they go about environmental issues. Can we move to the next slide? Another thing is like mandatory reports, disclosures will be published in financial statements. And here you have to be extremely careful. That raises the assurance level. So before, companies could just like pick and choose what they want to say, but like now regulations are asking them to disclose on XYZ. And you have to be sure that what you're disclosing at all times is accurate, not overinflated, not verbose. You just, like I said, keep it simple, short, and sweet. Then these days, there's so many information requests from like different vendors. How do you like balance information requests from like different vendors against like the resources that you have? So know when to push back. You don't have to respond to every vendor, and know who you are responding to.
I will just jump in. This is why it's critical when you are undergoing a contracting process, whether it's engaging a new customer, engaging a supplier, accepting investment from somebody. Read the documents that they're having you sign and engage with legal to make sure that if they have information and disclosure requirements, that you understand what is going to be asked of you and when and what you'll need to provide. It's usually not a great surprise if, and I see this sometimes in the context of the financing round where, companies are excited, investors coming in, they're signing side letters, and 6 months, a year later, they come back and they're saying, oh my goodness, this investor is asking for all of this information. Do we have to provide? And you open up a side letter and it says, in fact, you do, and you might need to provide more. So before you enter into contracts with folks, really take a close look at the things that they're asking you for and make sure that, you know, either number one, as of the day you're signing it, you're able to provide that information, or you have processes and systems in place that if there is a ramp up period, you're able to meet those obligations by the optimally before they ask for it. Sorry, Shay.
No worries at all. Thank you for chiming in there. Another thing that you also want to look out for is disconnected information. So for example, you started making your disclosures from 2020. Whatever you're saying in 2021 can't be too averse from what you have said in 2020. It has to be incremental. If you're switching gears, for example, you can't say last year that you're going to do XYZ or you did XYZ and then come in 2022, 2025 and say, oh, we're just kidding. We're not doing this anymore. Or no, I take that back. You can't do that with reports. Like, so you have to ensure that your information is connected, like because sometimes like stakeholders, if they're, for example, activists, if they're looking to get you, they will compare your two reports to see that the information is incremental, that, you know, whatever you said in 2024 ties with what you're going to, what you have said in 2023 ties with what you're saying in 2024. And so if you say that a material topic is no longer material and it's the same business, the same stakeholders, you have to be able to explain why you think it's no longer material, because your stakeholders, you may not necessarily put that in the report, but you want to be ready that if you're asked that, so maybe last year you said climate was a material topic to your company, and then this year you decide to disclose only on the S&G, you don't want to talk about climate. You have to be ready to be able to defend why your business has not changed, your industry has not changed, and all of a sudden climate is no longer material. And also like working with vendors, you have to be very careful because like Olga said earlier, your vendors don't really work with you internally. They work off of information that you provide to them. So you want to provide accurate information, and you also want to scrutinize whatever like deliverables they have given you to ensure that it ties with who you are as an organization and what you're trying to communicate, and it's accurate. Because organizations have like different, so if you look at an organization's website, they have like different units publishing different things on the website, and you have an external writer that maybe wants to help you write on your human capital disclosures. It has to tie with every other thing that you have said. You want to scrutinize everything, even though you're leveraging their expertise, you have to take it and look inwards. And another thing that is a big issue these days is over-reliance on software and technology. So there's software out there today that if you enter your data, they will populate it and they will produce a report for you. That's great. That's good. That's like one of the frontiers of ESG reporting, but you want to adopt those very cautiously because one, you know, the margin for error, and you need like human set of eyes to be able to like look through every line to ensure that whatever software you have used can help you deliver what your stakeholders want to see, what you're trying to see, and there's no errors in there. I think Olga wants to chime in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say the AI did it is not a really good excuse or defense. And so at the end of the day, the buck stops with the humans. And so if somebody gets overzealous, finds a program they really like, plugs it in, it publishes a report, and nobody takes a look at it, and it goes out and there are errors or things are calculated incorrectly, it's going to come down on you, the human beings. And, you know, yeah, you could say AI did it, but the question is always going to be, well, why didn't you check? And what processes did you have in place to ensure that what AI did was correct? You know, I would say in using these new tools, they're super great. They're super streamlined. They make things efficient, but it's kind of akin to like letting your intern do it all. You know, you'd never let your intern do something and not double check it. So that's how you should approach the AI or any other software.
Can we move to the next? I think this is the last slide before we go into breakouts.
Yeah, we're given the time and the amount of questions in the chat, what I propose to adapt our agenda a bit is that we skip over the 2 breakout slides and we finish the reporting risk management 2 content slides and then open it up for live Q&A in addition to addressing any of the questions that have come up in the recent few minutes. So given the time, I want to make sure that we have a few minutes to close the program. Let's have you know, our slide monitor move the slides 2 slides forward. and go on to reporting risk management. So let's take these two slides as our final content slides, and then we'll open it up and do a full Q&A. So we make sure we have full coverage and answer the questions that participants will have live, and of course, what's in the chat as well. So I think Olga, you're on deck for these two final content slides.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quickly. This is something, this information is basically everything that Bamashe and I have been talking about throughout the entire presentation. So I'll go through it a little bit quickly to give more time for the questions. Number one, you want to understand who's reading the report. Is it regulators who are focused on whether or not you're complying with what you need to be complying with? Is it shareholders? What is your shareholder base, right? Is it largely mom and pop angel investors, or is it really sophisticated VC firms who are going to be looking at it, probably closer to the level of the regulators? Are you publishing this report on the website for everyone to see and you can't control your audience, or is it going to be more internal and shared with shareholders, stakeholders, investors? Understanding your audience and why you're doing the report will help you craft the report and help your communication style around the report. You need to set goals and objectives. You need to make sure you can measure them, and you need to make sure you can back them up. You need good internal systems in place for collecting data and ensuring that you have all of the accurate data, right? You don't want certain departments just giving you the numbers that look really pretty. You want to make sure that things are accurately reported. Coherence is critical, especially as you become a larger company, especially as you become subject to regulations. And it's extra critical if you're a publicly reporting company, because, right, you don't want to be saying one thing in a report that you're putting out to regulators and a completely different thing to your shareholders or your investors. That's really going to get you into trouble. I think one part of our jobs, Bamashe and I, is looking at the ESG report for public companies and looking at it against the 10Ks and the proxies that they're putting out, and making sure that what they're saying in the reports is consistent. If you're identifying, 4 material things in your 10K, but then you're identifying 40 material things in your ESG report, questions are going to be asked about, well, which ones are actually material? And probably the question that's going to be asked is, if 40 things are material, why aren't you talking about all 40 in your 10K? And then you're going to have to start, trying to explain why material means one thing in this context and another. So it's just best if your reports say the same thing across all fields. And we're going to skip the software questions. There are a lot of new players in the space. We do have clients using them. We hesitate to talk about specific ones because, right now we're not really endorsing them. We do work with clients if they identify software providers that they really like, to make sure that, the package that they're providing, to us makes sense, but we try not to endorse any specific ones right now. Next slide. So just reporting risk management continued. You want to make sure for data gathering that if needed, you conduct legal data gathering exercises that are privileged. So limiting the folks that are involved in this, engaging outside counsel. And this is particularly true for more sensitive areas. If you think that there might be some litigation exposure. On litigation, you need to scrutinize disclosures for litigation risks, especially if these are going to be communicated outside of your organization. Even if you're not a public company, you just need to make sure that what you're saying is accurate, can be substantiated, and is not opening you up to lawsuits. There have been, unfortunately, trends across ESG-related lawsuits, and it's really important to track them and make sure that you're aware of them and you're not unknowingly putting yourself at risk. And then on data governance, I think we've said this so many times, but it's critical, disclose only what you can substantiate. And if you're disclosing aspirational goals, right, it's totally fine to talk about goals, but make sure when you're saying them, you're not just saying them because you really want to do it and think it's going to look good, but you have actual steps that your organization's planning on taking and is able to take to meet those goals in whatever timelines you're setting. So for example, if your organization hasn't done any work and tomorrow you come out and say, we're going to be net zero by 2025, right? That's going to be an issue in 2025. So you really need to think about what goals are you setting and communicating, and how you're actually going to achieve them. Data monitoring programs are crucial. You need to make sure that the data you're getting is good, it's verified. You want to avoid overinflating achievements, and you similarly want to avoid underinflating any problem areas. You want to make sure that your reports are really balanced and that they're painting the full picture. And, unless it's required, really try not to make a lot of those aspirational goals, particularly those where you don't have specific systems in place for achieving them. They sound good, they make you look good, but if you put out a goal of, net zero, and then the time comes and you didn't actually achieve it, you're going to have to explain why it didn't happen. And that potentially could do more harm than good. And then, just back to the legal risks, make sure you engage competent outside counsel to make sure that, there are no risks that you're not aware of. Antitrust is one of them, Next slide.
So, what an amazing presentation from both Bhamashay and Olga. So let me open it up for Q&A. I know we have some questions in the chat. I think we've answered some of them through the chat, but some of them maybe not. And then we want to open that up for live Q&A from anyone's perspective on challenges, specific questions. So let's start with the chat for a couple of minutes. Make sure, are there any that you would like to answer, Olga, as we scan ones that have been asked a little earlier? And in the meantime, let's see who might have a live question.
On the software piece, I think in terms of, due diligence best practices, it's really understanding the services that they provide, and also the level, like how involved you're going to need to be, right? Is it like, you have to understand what they're doing. Is this just a fancy software where you plug in all the data and it reorganizes it for you? Or is it a software that you connect with your internal systems and it scans them? Or, like, what is the software doing? And, what is good and what is not is really largely going to depend, offering to offering and company to company. And then for reports that are going to be read by multiple stakeholder types, unfortunately, this is another, it depends, right? This is where you'd potentially want to engage outside counsel, outside advisors to figure out what your report should look like. I will say, if you're not subject to mandatory reporting, this is kind of the green light, yellow light, red light to think about whether you should actually publish this report, right? You could engage with stakeholders, more informally and see what are they expecting from you before and go from there. I think.
Yeah. Also, I want to answer the question on whether reporting should be robust rather than oversimplified. And I will start with an example. So last year, 2023, saw the most ESG-related regulation, asking companies to come and disclose XYZ. And like we had said earlier, some disclosures cover like the larger companies, but because of like their value chain requirements, they're now implicating smaller companies. Now, companies have been making ESG disclosures for over 20 years. And they had so much leeway to like put in whatever in their reports because no one was asking, there were no technical requirements. What we're seeing that is happening now is that all that 20 years of work is now being threatened by regulations that came last year. And that's because a lot of companies have set goals, have made commitments, have ambiguous ambitions that they cannot measure up to by certain times. So a lot of companies have said that by 2030, by 2050, they're going to be net zero. It's 2024, and a lot of them are not close to being net zero. Now, they have said those things, and a lot of like stakeholders have relied on that information and made certain like alignment decisions, maybe investment decisions based on those things that companies said. And so when you get too robust, when you get too broad and you say way too many things, it actually opens you up to risk. But when I say like keep it short, sweet, and simple, is that you ask yourself, what do we want to say? How do we want to say it? And what is our goal? if you're able to answer those questions, it's just like lazy words. If you're trying to draft a statement, a sentence, they'll ask you if you can say XYZ and you remove that word, then you know that that word doesn't have to be in that sentence. And that's kind of how you think of your ESG. If you can communicate the fact that you're a values aligned company, you're a company that cares about ESG metrics, you're a company that is taking affirmative steps to ensure that you minimize your negative externalities, you maximize like positive opportunities, and you also like mitigate how much ESG risk your company is exposed to. If your reports can do those things, if your commitments can do those things, if your strategies can do those things, you don't have to go into so much detail. And you don't need a lot of detail to be able to communicate those 5 things that I just talked about. So it's just finding, just like Olga said, that right balance between saying what you're doing and saying just enough to be able to communicate your, because that's what a report should do. Tell people what you're doing, how you're doing, when you're doing it, or when you're going to do it. And so that's finding the right balance between like being robust and oversimplified. Because if your reports are too vague, that's another reason for like scrutiny. So balance is very, very important. Do we have any more questions?
Our time is going quickly. Let me open it up for burning questions. Who'd like to open their mic? Maybe we haven't gotten to your chat question. I know that Olga and Bamishe have been responding in the chat. So what questions who would like to open their microphone for a final question or two? Banu has a question in the chat. Given the fast pace of developments in this space, what else may be on the horizon in the near future we should be aware of? Great question, Banu. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, this is kind of trying to get out my crystal ball. I expect this space is going to become more standardized. Likely the reporting obligations and the frameworks are going to become more cohesive. Folks are probably going to, folks in industries are going to be adopting standards that are more widely adopted rather than the piecemeal framework. I think it's hard to say exactly what will be required, but especially if you're an earlier stage company, right? Thinking through the data that you have and trying to start putting policies and practices in place to gather the data before you scale and grow. So that way, as new folks join and, you hire an HR department and maybe you hire a sustainability individual, it's easier for them to plug in and build on what you're doing rather than start everything from scratch when you've gone from 5 people to 500 and now data lives with a number of different people and you don't know where to get it. So I think that's probably something that you can do to get ahead and get prepared. Look at the regulations that are coming out. I will say, I think the trend that we've been noticing is as later regulations are adopted, they're usually building upon prior regulations and existing frameworks rather than adopting things anew. That's really helpful in terms of company compliance. I think I'm not going to speak for regulators, but the goal is really to standardize the space and ensure that stakeholders and investors have accurate information that they need to, make their investment decisions. So the goal is not to get you in an aha, trap kind of situation. It's really to standardize the space. So figuring out where things are going and what kinds of information is really being focused on and starting to put in practices in place to gather that. In terms of resources for tracking developments in this space, I know MoFo is working on a tracker that we hope to release. We do publish client alerts on new regulations and legislation and any updates. So monitoring the MoFo website is a good start. Banashe, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Oh, you're on mute.
I was already actually typing in the chat. So you can definitely go to our website. We publish a lot of alerts on trends and developments, and we have a tracker, like Koga said. Other resources outside of MoFo that I use, I follow ESG Today. They publish what's happening voluntarily and with regulation. Tim Mohin on LinkedIn publishes a weekly newsletter that I really like. Then I listen to different podcasts, but I really like the Sustainability Communicator. So this podcast brings a lot of thought leaders in this space. Then for regulatory stuff, I have a tracker called Fiscal Notes. So those are these are my personal views, not MoFo's views, but these are things that I use personally to stay up to date. And I know that WCS also has like events that they do. I participate in like a lot of WCS events, and I find them very, very informative as well. So these workshops, the WCS talks, I find those very informative.
You know, Bamashe, those are fantastic recommendations, and certainly send me the links, and Denise, and we'll be sure to include, you know, if MoFo has a link for the new tracker and anything else that you'd like to share out when we get the recording and the PowerPoint. We'll add those resources to the registrant distribution following this program. So we do need to close because we are at time. Boy, we're wrapping up the workshop. Let me say quickly, remember the journey to mastering ESG reporting is ongoing. The regulatory environment continues to evolve and stakeholder expectations will grow. So you've gained some great knowledge. We'd like to thank Olga Touretz and Bamashe Anabanju, sorry, I knew I was going to blow that.
Anabanju, you're fine.
Anabanju. We'd like to thank MoFo also, as well as NextTracker, our corporate sponsor today, and everyone for their attendance and participation. Thank you once again for joining us. Your commitment to ESG excellence is inspiring, and we look forward to seeing the positive changes you'll bring to organizations and the world. So we're going to close at this moment and thank everyone again for their participation. We're going to skip the WCS closing remarks. The deck will have the slides, and we're glad to have everyone's participation today. Thank you so very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.